Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We like to get right into the really interesting stuff right away, and I think we've got a really fascinating topic in front of us.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one today.
So we're really looking at the idea of mission in the Old Testament. You've shared some really interesting sources with me that sort of point to this idea of mission from the Old Testament, and I think this is something that on the surface might not be that apparent.
Right.
But when you start to dig in, you can definitely see these seeds of mission present throughout a lot of the Hebrew scriptures.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm so excited about this topic. Today, we're going to look at the question, what are the original seeds of the idea of mission in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
Like you said, it's not always apparent when you just do like a surface reading of the text.
Right.
When you really get into it and you look at some of the things that the writers are saying, you begin to see, okay, there's a foundation for this idea of missions.
Yeah, and I think when we think about missions, it's very easy to kind of default to the New Testament,
Right.
to the Great Commission, and to the example of Paul.
Yeah.
But what we see is that even Paul himself was drawing on these Old Testament scriptures as a foundation for what he was doing.
Yeah.
And so to really understand kind of the development of this idea of mission, we really need to go all the way back.
That's right.
To the very beginning, to the Hebrew scriptures. And so that's really what we're going to do today.
That's right.
I think one of the first things that jumped out at me as I was reading through the sources you sent is that the early followers of Jesus, the early Christians, they really didn't see their mission as something totally new. They actually saw it as a continuation of Israel's calling.
Absolutely.
To bring other nations to the knowledge of Yahweh.
Yeah, I think that's an important point.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes I think we as Christians think that missions is something that the church came up with, after Jesus.
Right.
But it's actually rooted in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
As Israel being God's people, they were supposed to be a light to the nations.
Yeah, and you see this idea of forgiveness being preached to all nations as being tied back directly to the Old Testament in passages like Luke 24.4647. And then Paul in Galatians 3.8 even points back to the promise to Abraham as having this ultimate goal of reaching all of humanity.
That's right, and I think it's important to note what Paul says there.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't just say that the gospel was preached to Abraham.
Right.
He says that in you, all the nations will be blessed.
Right.
So from the beginning, with God's covenant with Abraham, it was intended for all the nations to be blessed.
Right.
That's why we often refer to the Abrahamic covenant as the foundation for world missions, because it's really through Abraham that God's blessing goes out to all the nations.
Yeah. And you see this idea play out as Paul himself begins to minister and preach the gospel.
Yeah.
And you see this sort of shift that happens in Acts 13 where he moves from focusing on the Jewish community to reaching out to the Gentiles in Antioch. And the way he justifies this is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
He quotes Isaiah 49.6b, which says, "A light for the Gentiles." He sees this Old Testament passage as a direct instruction from God to go beyond the Jewish community and share this message with the wider world.
That's right. He saw himself as fulfilling those words from Isaiah.
And this wasn't just Paul kind of doing his own thing.
Right.
The book of Ephesians talks about Jesus fulfilling God's eternal missionary purpose.
Yeah.
A purpose that the writer emphasizes was present from the beginning. So this idea of God desiring for everyone to know his wisdom and his plan of salvation. This wasn't something that was just kind of thought up later on. It was there from the very start. Right.
That's right. God's desire to have a relationship with every person was there from the beginning. And that really, I think, shows us that God is a missionary God. That's his heart.
And it all points back to Jesus himself, understanding his own life and his own mission.
Yeah.
Through the lens of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That encounter on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Jesus is gently rebuking his followers for not understanding what the prophets had said.
Yeah.
And then he goes back through the scriptures all the way from Moses through the prophets to show how they all pointed to him. And so Jesus himself really saw his life and his ministry as the fulfillment of these Old Testament scriptures.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that he didn't just point to like one passage.
Right.
He said, beginning with Moses and all the prophets he interpreted to them in all the scriptures, the things concerning himself.
Yeah.
So it was like a survey of the whole Old Testament.
Yeah.
And how it all pointed to him.
And it wasn't just, about who he was,
right?
But also about what he would accomplish.
Yeah.
During the Last Supper, he even referenced Isaiah 53.12, which talks about the suffering servant being numbered with the transgressors.
Yeah.
And he said, this scripture must be fulfilled in me. So he saw his suffering, his death on the cross, as being the fulfillment of what Isaiah had predicted centuries earlier.
Yeah, the whole point of the suffering servant was to suffer for the sins of the people.
Yeah.
And Jesus saw himself as that suffering servant.
And it wasn't just his suffering. Matthew even connects Jesus's healing ministry to Isaiah's prophecies.
Yeah.
He quotes Isaiah 42.1. It's interesting, though, that Matthew leaves out the very end of that verse.
Yeah.
Which talks about the coastlands waiting for his teaching.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder why that part was left out.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like Matthew is so focused on Jesus as the Messiah and fulfilling that role that he kind of glosses over the mission to the Gentiles.
Right.
But it's still there implicitly.
Yeah.
Because the suffering servant is the one who brings salvation to the ends of the earth.
Yeah, and that's a really key point. The early church really understood that Jesus was this embodiment of Isaiah's suffering servant.
Yeah.
And the servant was also envisioned as the one who would bring the knowledge of Yahweh to all the nations. You see this in passages like Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 52.
That's right. So the early church saw this continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of those Old Testament prophecies.
So it seems like the early church really understood that sharing the good news wasn't just some new idea they came up with, but something that was rooted in God's will as revealed in the Old Testament. This really laid a foundational basis for their missionary efforts.
Yeah, and it's important to make a distinction here, I think, between what your source calls the missionary idea and then the foundation for missions.
Okay.
So the foundation for missions is that God cares about all people.
Right.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? That's the universality of God.
Yeah.
That he created everyone. And he desires everyone to know him.
Right.
The missionary idea then is the idea that we, as God's people, should go and share that with everyone.
Right.
And so the Old Testament really lays that groundwork for the first God's universal concern.
Right.
But it also plants the seeds for the second.
Right.
That we should actually go and share.
Okay, so let's dig into this idea of universality in the Old Testament.
Okay.
Where do we first see these indications that God's concern wasn't just limited to one particular group?
Well, I think Genesis gives it some of the clearest examples of this right from the beginning.
Yeah.
God is presented as the creator of everything.
Right.
He created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
All the animals, all the plants.
Yeah.
And all the people. So there's no one excluded.
Right.
Everyone is under his authority.
Yeah.
And then you have the fall in Genesis 3.
Yeah.
And while the fall is a very sad event, it actually lays the foundation for missions because it brings all of humanity under sin and judgment.
Right.
And so if everyone is in need of redemption, then that redemption has to be universal in scope.
That's a good point. If the problem is universal, then the solution also needs to be universal.
That's right.
And what comes next in Genesis that points towards this wider concern?
Well, I think the covenant with Noah after the flood in Genesis 9 is a really powerful example.
Okay.
Because God sets up the rainbow as a sign of his covenant.
Yeah.
And it's not just a covenant with humanity.
Right.
It's a covenant with every living creature.
Yeah.
Of all flesh that is on the earth.
Yeah. So it's much broader than just one nation or one group of people.
That's right. It's the whole creation that God is making this covenant with.
And then the story of Tower of Babel in Genesis 11 also kind of fits in here as well.
Yeah.
God's action of confusing the languages and scattering the people across the earth.
Yeah.
This affected the whole world.
Yeah.
It was a divine intervention that actually shaped the diversity of nations that we see today.
That's right. And before that,
we
we see in Genesis 10 this list of all the nations that descended from Noah.
Right.
So it's like God is giving us this picture of the whole world before he then zooms in on Abraham and the nation of Israel.
So even in those early chapters of Genesis, we're seeing this recurring theme of God's involvement with all of humankind.
That's right. He's not just the God of Israel. He's the God of the whole world.
How does this play out as we move into the books of the prophets?
Well, in the prophets, we see prophets pronouncing judgment on a variety of nations.
Okay.
We see Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos. Yeah. They all address foreign nations. So it's clear that God is concerned about what's going on in the whole world, not just in Israel.
And even when these nations, don't respond to God's grace, he still acts, even if it's in judgment.
That's right, because they were still his creation. Yeah. And he's still the Lord over them.
And we even see moments of grace extended to these other nations, like in Isaiah 19.25, where God says, "Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." That's quite a statement, putting Egypt and Assyria on a similar level with Israel.
Yeah, and what's remarkable there is that Egypt and Assyria were Israel's enemies.
Right.
And yet God is saying they're blessed.
Yeah.
Which I think shows us that God's love and his concern extends even to those who were opposed to his people.
And in Amos 9.11b, we hear about nations who are called by my name. Yeah. And then even more striking is Amos 9.7, where God compares the people of Ethiopia to the people of Israel, reminding them that he brought other nations like the Philistines and the Arameans out of captivity.
Yeah, that's right. And he says are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites?
Right.
He's saying, I brought you out of Egypt. Yeah. But I also brought the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Ker.
Yeah, and I think a really key insight from this passage is that God chose Israel not just because he loved them in isolation, but for the sake of these other peoples as well.
Yeah, he wanted to use Israel to be a blessing to all the nations.
So it seems like God was constantly at work through these nations around Israel, sometimes to help Israel, sometimes to correct them. Yeah. But he was always at work.
Yeah, that's right.
In the wider world.
And he used Gentile kings to accomplish his purposes.
Yeah, you see this with the Assyrian king, who's referred to as a hired razor, and then later as the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates River. Yeah. God used him, even though he was a wicked king, to accomplish his purposes.
And even Nebuchadnezzar, who was, a very powerful king, God humbled him. Yeah. And he eventually acknowledged the Most High God. Yeah. So even the most powerful kings on earth are still under God's authority.
Yeah. And then you see Cyrus and Darius, the Persian kings, who also had these encounters with the God of Israel and even issued decrees acknowledging him and his power.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it's interesting how God uses the kings of the earth to accomplish his will.
It's almost unexpected, these powerful rulers bowing before a God that they weren't originally familiar with.
Yeah, it's a testimony to the power of God.
And these instances really show God's ability to work through anyone, even those outside of Israel, to achieve what he intends.
And I think the surprising result is that these kings, they actually recognize and respond to God's work. Yeah. They see what God is doing, and they're amazed by it. Yeah. And they acknowledge his power.
Even lesser figures like Gog in Ezekiel are used by God to make himself known among the nations.
That's right. So it's not just the kings. Yeah. God uses all sorts of people to accomplish his will.
It's important to remember, though, that Isaiah's view of other nations wasn't entirely one of inclusion. Right. There are also strong themes of separation and judgment.
Directed at specific nations.
Yeah, we can't oversimplify Isaiah. Yes. There are definitely passages in Isaiah where he pronounced judgment on the nations and even calls for vengeance against Babylon.
So it's a complex picture.
It is.
But you definitely see this idea of God's universal sovereignty present throughout the Old Testament.
And the Psalms also contribute to that.
Yeah, how so?
Well, the psalmists, they frequently sing about God. Yeah. Owning, rebuking, judging, ruling, disciplining, and even laughing at the nations. Okay. So they recognize his power and authority over everything.
So we see this foundation of God's universal concern.
Yeah.
Pretty solid throughout the Old Testament. Now let's move on to maybe some more direct hints of a missionary intent.
Okay.
Where do we start to see this idea that Israel had a role to play in bringing this knowledge of God to others?
Well, I think the covenant that God makes with Abraham.
In Genesis 12:1-3 is really the foundation for this idea.
Okay.
Because God doesn't just promise to bless Abraham. He says that through Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Yeah.
So the blessing that comes to Abraham is intended to go out to all the nations.
And this promise is repeated with Isaac and Jacob.
Yeah.
And then later extended to the entire nation of Israel when they're called a kingdom of priests in Exodus 19.4-8.
That's right. And that phrase, kingdom of priests, is really significant because it suggests that Israel was supposed to be a mediator between God and the nations.
Yeah, and you also see that they're called a special treasure.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that they have a specific role, that they're set apart for a purpose.
Yeah, to be a blessing to the nations.
But as you point out in your sources, Israel's response to this calling wasn't always what it could have been.
Yeah, sadly that's true. They often struggled to remember God's care for the other nations and their own role in bringing blessing to them.
Yeah.
So their understanding and their actions often fell short of God's intention.
It seems like fear played a big part in this.
Yeah.
You know, they were afraid of their religious beliefs being contaminated.
Right.
They were constantly under threat of military attacks.
Yeah.
So they kind of retreated into this isolationist way of thinking.
Yeah, they wanted to protect themselves.
Yeah.
And their way of life.
And you mentioned Moses as being one of the early figures.
Yeah.
With a missionary role.
Yeah.
Introducing the Hebrews to the concept of I am.
That's right. Moses was the one who met God at the burning bush.
Yeah.
And God revealed himself as I am.
Right.
And so Moses was the one who brought that revelation to the people of Israel.
Yeah, and that declaration in Exodus 19 about being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation really lays the groundwork for this idea of Israel mediating God to other peoples, even if they didn't always live up to it.
That's right. The potential was there.
Yeah.
The calling was present.
Yeah.
But their focus on themselves often overshadowed this broader purpose.
Yeah, it took time for the seed to grow.
Okay.
We also see this idea of mission present in Solomon's prayer when he dedicated the temple.
Yeah.
He specifically prays for foreigners who would come from distant lands when they hear of Yahweh's great name.
That's right.
And he asked that their prayers be answered.
Yeah.
So that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful expression of the growing awareness of Israel's mission.
Yeah.
But it's still primarily a centripetal movement.
What do you mean by that?
It's people coming to Israel.
Okay.
Rather than Israel going out to the people.
So the focus is on people coming to the temple.
You know, coming to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
To worship God.
Okay.
It's not yet this idea of Israel going out as missionaries to the nations.
Yeah.
But it's still a step forward.
Right.
Because it recognizes that God is concerned about all the peoples of the earth.
And the Psalms continue to reflect this concern for other nations knowing Yahweh.
That's right.
We see prayers for God to bless Israel so that his ways might be known among the nations. Prayers for oppressors to be put to shame so that they would seek his name. Calls for all peoples to praise the Lord and to stand in awe of him. There's definitely a missionary spirit present in these songs.
Yeah, they want the whole world to know the God of Israel.
Yeah, and you even see this call for Israel to tell of God's deeds and to sing his praises among the nations.
Yeah.
The psalm writers even express their own personal intention to do so. And then you have those psalms that look forward to a time when all the nations will worship the Lord.
Yeah, they have this future vision of a time when everyone will know God.
And then we get to the prophets. Yeah. And Isaiah really stands out as a powerful voice for God's universal nature.
That's right. Isaiah is very clear that Yahweh is the only God.
And this emphasis on monotheism naturally leads to this idea of universality.
That's right, because if Yahweh is the only God, then he must be the God of the whole world.
Right.
And if he's the God of the whole world, then everyone needs to know him and worship him.
And Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 really lay out a three-part answer to how other nations will come to know God. The first is through Israel living according to God's word.
That's right.
The second is through God's rescue of the exiled Israelites, which would impress the Gentiles. And then the third is through Israel actively declaring that Yahweh is the one and only God.
So they were supposed to both live it and proclaim it.
And we see this reflected in prophecies about nations streaming to Zion, God glorifying Israel so that other nations will respond, and about God's concern for foreigners who join themselves to the Lord. And the idea of God's house becoming a place of prayer for all peoples.
That's a really beautiful picture in Isaiah 56, where he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." So it's not just for the Jews. It's for everyone.
Isaiah 66.18-23 really seems like a high point in terms of this outward-looking vision.
It is. It's like the climax of Isaiah's prophecy. He sees God gathering all nations, setting up a sign, setting out survivors to declare his glory to the coastlands, to the ends of the earth. And the result is that all flesh comes to worship before the Lord.
So it's this beautiful vision of universal worship. And then you have Isaiah 42 and 49 with this concept of the suffering servant who's not only a covenant to Israel, but also a light to the nations.
That's right. He's both. He's a light to Israel, and he's a light to the Gentiles.
And this is the one who will bring salvation to the ends of the earth.
That's right.
You know, you even referred to Isaiah 49.6 as the Great Commission of the Old Testament.
I think it's a fitting title. Because it really encapsulates the mission of the servant.
And then you have the book of Jonah, which despite Jonah's own reluctance, really serves as a powerful message about God's concern for even the enemies of Israel.
Jonah's a fascinating character. Because he's so relatable. You know, he's called by God to go to Nineveh, which is the enemy of Israel. And he doesn't want to go. And he actually runs away from God. But God pursues him. And eventually gets him to Nineveh. And then Jonah preaches this message of judgment. And the Ninevites repent. And God relents from his judgment.
And this upsets Jonah.
It does. Because he wanted to see Nineveh destroyed. But God is showing Jonah that he's concerned about all people. Even his enemies.
And it's a reminder to us that God's perspective is so much broader than our own.
That's right.